You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, and 3 Men and a Mystery. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking.
Mike is feeling a little under the weather this week, so I will be reading his parts in the introduction phase to this podcast. The conversation in the second part of the podcast will be as normal. Thank you. On September the 25th, 1990, a small cipher was mailed on the back of a Carmel beachfront postcard, postmarked Oakland, California, given the title of Celebrity Cipher by its sender and addressed to the Vallejo Times-Herald in Vallejo, California. It gave us an encrypted name at the top left and bottom right of the postcard, consisting of 13 characters, with what is thought to be "My name is," immediately preceding the hidden name. The September the 25th, 1990 postcard appeared to be teasing us with a hidden name, entirely consistent with the cryptic Christmas card dubbed the Eureka Card, mailed from Eureka, California only 3 months later. Possibly mailed shortly before Christmas Day, the Eureka Card depicts a Christmas scene of a snowman adorned with a Groucho Marx-style face, red bobble hat, and a green and white striped scarf with a small rabbit facing the snowman. The wording on the card exterior read, "From your secret pal. Can't guess who I am yet? Well, look inside and you'll find out." And once opened, it revealed, "That I'm going to keep you guessing. Happy holidays anyway." The card maker was the American Greetings Card Company, founded in Brooklyn, Ohio, in 1906 by Jacob Saperstein, a Polish immigrant. It was originally called the Saperstein Greeting Card Company. Just like the Celebrity Cipher postcard, the Christmas greeting card also contained the offering of a name, this time to be unearthed using the numbers etched onto 2 photocopied post office box keys contained within the card. The 2 numbers were 79408 and 58851, one of which was traced to a Eureka resident by the name of Chester Clark Klingle. But the question of why the keys were photocopied was examined by Nin, a contributor to Tom Voigt's message board. This person noticed that according to Wikipedia, quote, Xerox was founded in 1906 in Rochester, New York, as the Haloid Photographic Company. It manufactured photographic paper and equipment. In 1938, Chester Carlson, a physicist working independently, invented a process for printing images using an electrically charged photoconductor-coated metal plate and dry powder toner. However, it would take more than 20 years of refinement before the first automated machine to make copies were commercialized, using a document feeder, scanning light, and a rotating drum. Chester Floyd Carlson is best known for inventing electrophotography, the process performed today by millions of photocopiers worldwide. Carlson's process produced a dry copy as contrasted with the wet copies then produced by the mimeograph process. Carlson's process was renamed xerography, a term that means dry writing. End quote. Therefore, we have 2 post office box keys, one belonging to Chester Clark Klingle from Eureka, photocopied using a technique pioneered by Chester Floyd Carlson and placed in an envelope postmarked Eureka. The 3 clues to his name being the number on one of the keys, the postmark of Eureka, and possibly the phonetic namesake of Chester Floyd Carlson. The Eureka Card was discovered on March the 3rd, 2007 by editorial assistant Daniel King of the San Francisco Chronicle among some photo files. The 2007 movie, directed by David Fincher and based on the Robert Graysmith book, was released in the USA the day before this correspondence was unearthed. According to Tom Voigt, having acquired the greeting card and its contents, he recalled the events in 2007. Quote, "Once we finished with the film festivities in San Francisco, I headed straight to Eureka and the old post office. My thinking was that the numbers on the keys might be a clue to the identity of the sender, whom I believed to be Zodiac. I used a bit of trickery to get the name of the box holder, Chester Clark Klingle. Eventually, the California State Department of Justice took over the case, verified all our interesting findings, and launched its own investigation. The conclusion was that Chester Clark Klingle III could be the Zodiac Killer. The department then launched a covert operation to get his DNA. Undercover investigators dressed as garbage men in a garbage truck snagged a coffee cup and felt they belonged to Klingle. The DNA from the cup didn't match the possible DNA from the Zodiac Killer." End quote. Further research discovered that Chester Clark Klingle lived in Mill Valley, Marin County, at the time taxicab driver Paul Stein was murdered in Presidio Heights on October the 11th, 1969, and worked for the Fireman's Fund Insurance Company on California Street, San Francisco. Chester Clark Klingle would have been 43 years of age at the time of the Stein murder, matching the eyewitness statements given by the three sets of eyewitnesses at Presidio Heights. The three teenagers in the police report described the suspect in his early 40s. Officer Donald Fouke described the suspect in the age range of 35 to 45, and the eyewitnesses who spotted a man running into the Julius Kahn playground described the suspect as about 40. According to the 2017 obituary of Chester Clark Klingle, it stated that Chet's first wife, Yolanda, passed away in a car accident. His second marriage was short, but his third to Blandina Sarkis added love, happiness, family, and great food to his life. He had many good years in Tam Valley, California, before beginning a farming venture near Turlock, California. Chet and Blandina bought nut orchards and developed a successful walnut hulling and drying business. After Blandina passed away, the farming project lost appeal. Chet sold the farm and moved to Eureka, California, where he made new friends. The obituary stated that Chester Clark Klingle moved to Eureka after Blandina Sarkis Klingle died. She died on September the 9th, 1993, aged 63. Therefore, if the obituary is accurate, Chester Clark Klingle moved to Eureka subsequent to her death in September 1993. This would mean the Eureka Card was mailed by its author, or Zodiac, while Chester still lived in Turlock, which sits 370 miles from the port city of Eureka in Humboldt County. After Chester married his wife Blandina in 1965, they visited relatives regularly in Turlock before they purchased a property at 6413 East Keys Road in Houston, California in 1973. Now the Alpine Pacific Nut Company. They eventually sold this property along with 2 Bay Area houses and bought a 20-acre ranch from walnut huller Glenn DeLay in 1976, which Blandina and Chester farmed together as a nut hulling business. They would, along with a friend, lease an additional 40 acres to make the business venture profitable. It can be seen that Chester Clark Klingle had ties to Turlock from 1965 onwards, before he bought the property in Keys Road in 1973. If the Zodiac Killer was responsible for the abduction of Kathleen Johns close to Modesto on March the 22nd, 1970, and lived in the Bay Area, it's highly unlikely he would travel 170 miles round trip to select a random victim on a lonely stretch of highway, opening up the possibility he was travelling back from visiting family or friends, or had business dealings in the Turlock or Houston region that weekend, 2 areas that sit slightly south of Modesto. The Zodiac Killer may have had connections to the Turlock region that began before the Kathleen Johns abduction in 1970, that continued up to the time and beyond that Chester Clark Klingle purchased the property in Keys Road and the nut hulling business from Glenn DeLay in 1976. If their paths crossed somewhere in Turlock, then this would have provided the opportunity for the Zodiac Killer to take possession of the post office box key belonging to Chester, along with the other post office box key, very likely held on the same keychain. It is highly unlikely these keys were acquired separately. If the Eureka card was hinting at the name Chester by way of the photocopied keys, then the author of the Eureka card either traced the identity of the key owners himself after finding them, or knew the identity of the key's owners at the time he took possession of them, leading to the possibility that he knew Chester Clark Klingle or had business dealings with him. A souring business relationship could have fueled the desire to frame Chester for the Zodiac crimes at a later date, despite the Eureka card not explicitly mentioning the pseudonym of Zodiac. But if the photocopied key of Chester Clark Klingle was mailed from Eureka 3 years before he moved there, did the sender of the Eureka card have knowledge that a member of his family already lived in Eureka in 1990, or did the sender have personal information in relation to the post office box location? This sort of knowledge would certainly indicate that the author of the Eureka card had close dealings or a close relationship with Chester. The idea that Chester Clark Klingle mailed a photocopy of his own post office box key, knowing he was the Zodiac Killer, would be a highly unlikely proposition. Kathleen Johns had travelled along Highway 99 through Merced and Turlock on her way to Modesto and Highway 132 that night, with Highway 99 passing under East Keys Road, only 1.6 miles from the 15-acre farm once owned by Chester and his wife Blandina. Had the Zodiac Killer latched onto the vehicle of Kathleen Johns in the region of Turlock or Modesto, when both were travelling the same route to the Bay Area that night, with Kathleen en route from San Bernardino to Petaluma to visit her sick mother, with the Zodiac Killer possibly having finished visiting friends or family, or finalised business in the Turlock region. This is just one possibility to how the Zodiac Killer may have crossed paths with Chester Clark Klingle, and although it may be grasping at straws, it doesn't hurt to explore every avenue in the perpetually confusing case of the Bay Area murderer. 3 years before the Eureka card was mailed, on October the 28th, 1987, the Zodiac Killer mailed a Halloween letter mentioning the feature film The Car, released 10 years earlier in 1977. The Car, directed by Elliot Silverstein and written by Michael Butler, centres around a possessed car embarking on a murderous rampage in a small American town. The 1990 Eureka card, which appeared to depict a Groucho Marx-styled snowman, may have been inspired by the feature film Terror Train, released 10 years earlier in 1980. Terror Train, directed by Roger Spottiswoode and starring Jamie Lee Curtis, Ben Johnson and David Copperfield, follows the murderous rampage of a traumatised student. Here is a small excerpt from Wikipedia. Quote, "At a Northern Illinois University's fraternity's New Year's Eve party, a reluctant Alana Maxwell is coerced into participating in a prank. She lures the shy and awkward pledge, Kenny Hampson, into a darkened room on the promise of a sexual liaison. However, some of the students have placed a woman's corpse, stolen from the university medical school during the Christmas vacation, in the bed instead. Kenny is traumatised by the prank and is sent to a psychiatric hospital. 3 years later, the members of the same fraternities and sororities hold a New Year's Eve costume party aboard a train. Class clown, Ed, is disguised as Groucho Marx. Prank ringleader, Doc Manley, is disguised as a monk. Jackson is disguised as an alien lizard. Mitchie, Doc's girlfriend and Alana's best friend, is disguised as a witch. And Alana's boyfriend, Mo, is disguised as a bird. Also along are Khan, the train's conductor, and a magician hired to entertain the crowd. Ed is murdered prior to boarding, and the killer dresses himself in Ed's Groucho Marx mask, allowing him to board the train unnoticed." End quote. The killer, Kenny Hampson, then embarks on a murderous rampage, dressed as Groucho Marx, taking revenge for the psychologically traumatizing prank inflicted upon him by the students. The prank and the train ride both took place on New Year's Eve, so it would be interesting to find the exact date in December that the Eureka Card was postmarked. If it was December the 31st, 1990, then we have Christmas, New Year's Eve, and a Groucho Marx disguise, all wrapped up in one greeting card. Another curious link to Groucho Marx ties in with the Exorcist letter mailed in 1974. The Zodiac Killer described the Exorcist movie as the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen, and quoted a small section of Titwillow from the Mikado. The Exorcist book author, William Peter Blatty, was a close friend of Groucho Marx, and there was an intention by Marx to dress as the priest Father Lancaster Merrin from the movie and appear on the set of the Exorcist film. But due to scheduling matters, the comedic entrance of Groucho Marx never materialized. But in one episode of the popular You Bet Your Life series, hosted by Groucho Marx, William Peter Blatty was a contestant and walked away with a prize of $10,000. When he was asked what he was going to do with the money, William Peter Blatty stated he was to take some time off to work on a novel. That novel was the acclaimed inspiration for the movie The Exorcist. Groucho Marx was a lifelong fan of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas, appearing as Coco in a production of The Mikado on NBC's Bell Telephone Hour in 1960, featuring Titwillow, that appeared in the Zodiac Killer's Exorcist letter. The other option explored for the Groucho Marx depiction in the Eureka Card is that the killer wore a fake nose and glasses in the April 7th, 1971 film The Zodiac Killer, directed by Tom Hansen. The 1990 Eureka Card and envelope were not released into the public domain until 2007, so the author of the January the 10th, 2001 Happy New Year card, allegedly written by Zodiac, could not have mimicked the author of the 1990 Eureka Card, yet the author of the 2001 envelope used the address style of 901 Mission Street and the zip code of 94103, exactly like the author of the Eureka Card envelope. In other words, the person who claimed to be Zodiac in 2001 chose to use an address style never used before in any confirmed Zodiac communications, opting to mimic an envelope he could never have seen. The 1990 Eureka Card and 2001 Happy New Year card, whether Zodiac or not, were mailed 11 years apart. We are not aware of any other Zodiac or alleged copycat communications in between these years. If there has been any, they have not been released. We have to look at these two communications in respect to all the confirmed and suspected copycat letters from 1969 to 2001, a span of 32 years. If these two communications were not the same author, and the 2001 author couldn't have copied the 1990 author, then it is unusual that these final two communications are both festive greetings cards, a form of communication never mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, or Vallejo Times-Herald by the Zodiac Killer or a copycat in the 32 years prior. Bearing in mind the propensity of Zodiac to respond to recent newspaper articles, it was no surprise that the January the 10th, 2001 card slammed the Muni drivers of San Francisco for the running down of pedestrians. The day before, on January the 9th, 2001, the Examiner ran an article describing how a Muni streetcar struck and killed pedestrian Guangzhou Yang on Sunday, January the 7th, 2001. Another fatality occurred on January the 8th on Van Ness Avenue. Two newspaper articles from the Examiner were uncovered by Craigle, a contributor to both main Zodiac forums, And these are undoubtedly the trigger for the January the 10th, 2001 Happy New Year card. After all, the author opened up with the lines, "Dear Sir, wherever you are, this is disgusting to read. What seems to be a news that nobody really cares, but the relatives of innocent citizens murdered in our beloved San Francisco. It's always the pedestrians' fault, and never those bastard Mooney drivers." On October the 2nd, 2000, 2 months before this greeting card arrived, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a comprehensive article about Mike Rodelli's suspect, Shel Cavalli. Within the article, it mentioned longtime Zodiac suspect Arthur Lee Allen, stating, "The man considered by some to be the best suspect, former Vallejo teacher and trailer park resident Arthur Lee Allen, took his secrets to the grave when he died of a heart attack in 1992. The close proximity of the greeting card to this now rare San Francisco Chronicle article about the Zodiac Killer, mentioning the death of the highest profile Zodiac suspect, may have triggered the rebuttal at the end of the 2001 card, where the author wrote, "You thought I was dead? No way." It would make more sense that the choice of imagery within the 1990 Eureka card was harking back to the Zodiac Killer movie from 1971 and the appearance of the Zodiac Killer wearing a fake nose and glasses, with the Eureka card cover image effectively linking the Zodiac Killer to the name of Chester Clark Klingle through the photocopied key within the card. The eyeglasses on the Eureka card have eyebrows placed on the upper rim with a moustache attached to the nose identical to what are termed Groucho glasses, also known as the Beagle Puss or GM 2020s, which were often used as a caricature to mimic the way Groucho Marx appeared in his movies and vaudeville performances. These novelty glasses were sold as early as the 1940s. If the Zodiac Killer used this imagery in conjunction with the card introduction, "Your Secret Pal," and wording, "Can't you guess who I am yet?" then it's possible he is equating Groucho Marx to the Zodiac Killer through the 1971 film. However, the Groucho Marx disguise in the movie Terror Train is much more in line with the imagery on the Eureka card than that featured in the Zodiac Killer film from 1971. If the Eureka card was a Zodiac Killer, we have to weigh up the likelihood of Chester's keys coming into the possession years prior to the mailing of the Christmas card, compared to the Zodiac Killer acquiring the key and mailing a photocopy of it in relatively close succession. If the latter was the case, then the emphasis should be focused on Turlock, where, according to the obituary, Chester Clark Klingle lived in 1990. We also have to question whether the mailing of a festive greeting card, as opposed to a standard letter, had any relevance with regards to Chester Clark Klingle and any relationship he may have had with the Zodiac Killer. What we do know is that the last 3 known potential Zodiac communications all come in card form, starting with the celebrity cipher on September the 25th, 1990, and ending with the January the 10th, 2001 Happy New Year card. However, a belief that these were the only communications mailed with a potential Zodiac link over a 9-year period would probably be a misguided one.
This is a Zodiac speaking.
Right, what I would first like to discuss, Mike, is the arrival, or discovery, should I say, of the Eureka card in 2007. Now, when this card was mailed originally in December 1990, it was addressed to the editor, but somehow seemed to have completely bypassed the editor and ended up in some photo files in a cabinet somewhere, which is unusual. And obviously from 1990 to 2007, there must have been several editors, I would have thought, unless there was one editor throughout. And I find it curious that if they'd suspected it was the Zodiac Killer when it arrived, it would have either been sent to the police or put in some sort of Zodiac section. And then the day after the Fincher movie appeared on March the 2nd, 2007, this communication was suddenly discovered. How do we explain this unusual timing?
Well, it's interesting, the timing. It's hard to dismiss that they found that date. What I'm thinking is maybe because of the release of the movie, they may have said, well, let's run an article that the movie's out, and we'll go back and check through our stuff and see if we have any interesting things we can talk about and things we've received over the years. And then they found this Eureka card that was lost in their stuff, and they said, holy cow, this looks like it might be a Zodiac correspondence. What's interesting about the Eureka card itself is it doesn't say any place on it Zodiac. It doesn't say anything threatening. There's nothing really there. And I wonder in the first place how they associated that with Zodiac. Now, we don't know if there was perhaps something else that came along with it, maybe like a piece of paper inside it that didn't get saved. They saved the envelope, they saved the card. Maybe there was something else that came with it that was lost that made them think it might be Zodiac early on, which is why they decided to hold on to it. But the card itself really isn't threatening, and it doesn't say Zodiac, but it's interesting that they decided to save it anyhow.
Do you think they only concluded it was Zodiac based on the handwriting on the envelope?
Well, I would think they had thousands and thousands of letters getting mailed in there. So unless someone was sitting around looking for handwriting that matched, I don't know. I would think it's hard that someone would be sitting there looking for Zodiac letters in 1990. If it was 1969, sure, I could see them having somebody whose job was to look out for possible Zodiac letters. But in 1990, I just don't know how someone would catch it and say, I think this is Zodiac. But something, obviously, whatever it was, caught their eye about it, and they decided to hold on to it.
Do we know who the editor was back in 1990?
I don't know. That's actually a good question, and I don't know if we could find that out. But
I looked today, but I couldn't seem to find it anywhere.
Yeah, I think Kevin Fagan at the Chronicle could probably point us in the right direction with that, and it might be worth just trying to figure out who that was, because if they're still around, maybe they'll have some recollection of it.
You just said that there was nothing on the card or the envelope that sort of suggested it was Zodiac. It didn't have his typical crosshairs or the introduction or anything. And so what I would like to say, we know that one of the keys was traced to a P.O. box from Chester Clark Klingle. Now, if the Zodiac Killer wanted to frame Chester Clark Klingle, did he have to leave the contents of the card particularly vague, leaving out any Zodiac traits such as the crosshairs and running total, because he wanted it to appear as though Chester had sent the greeting card but had made a mistake by leaving the post office keys readable after, recent enhancements that people have done? If the Zodiac Killer had left his usual identifying traits on the card, the key numbers extremely visible, then it would be patently obvious to police that Chester wouldn't have done this.
Yeah, I personally don't think Chester was the Zodiac, and I don't have any reason why. I couldn't explain why, if he was, he would take the chance of mailing photos of his own post office box keys in, because I think anyone that knows anything about post office boxes, those keys have a number on there so that they can be, if the key needs to be duplicated, they can use that key, and it has a record of who's attached to that key. So taking that number into the Eureka post office is going to be pretty easy to determine who that key belonged to. So my thinking is that whoever sent that card wanted some attention on Chester Klingle. I think they knew that the keys could be traced back to Chester Klingle. But again, I go back to, if you want to give the police some busy work and you want to send them down a rabbit hole, why not say, I'm the Zodiac and you can't catch me, and include the picture of the keys in there? Because then they'd really, they would know it's a Zodiac letter. They'd bring it right to the police, and then they'd be chasing down Chester Klingle, which they ultimately identified. So the fact that the person didn't include the name Zodiac on there, but seemed to want to frame Chester Klingle, I think is interesting. Now, another question is, where did the person get those keys to frame Chester Klingle. I think the story is that Chester claimed that he lost those keys at some point. And it may very well be, but I always wonder, were one of his friends or someone he was associated with, or maybe someone he worked with, or someone who had a grudge against him, could they have stolen his keys in order to frame him? There's a lot we still just don't know.
Well, we'll go into that in a little more depth in a while, but you should know more about post office box keys than me, living in America. You can't find keys on the floor and just wander up to the post office and ask the identity of the person who the keys belong to, can you?
No. So I think that brings us to two possibilities. That Zodiac, or whoever sent it, I don't want to jump to the conclusion say it was Zodiac, but whoever sent that in trying to frame Chester, maybe they weren't trying to frame Chester. Maybe they just found it on the floor, and whoever the keys belonged to, they were going to try and make the police go chasing after them. Maybe it wasn't Chester that was targeted, but rather the person that mailed it found those keys and knew the police would have some busy work and would go looking for someone else and waste their time. So it could be that it's something as simple as that as well.
So if the Eureka card was mailed by the Zodiac Killer, we can probably surmise that the inclusion of the post office keys of Chester was done with malicious intent. It could be argued that the personal nature of including the key may be a result of a bad business dealing, leading to the Zodiac taking his revenge by attempting to frame Chester. Assuming the key was taken from Chester and mailed in a relatively short period of time. In other words, the key was taken, say, November or December of 1990. This is likely the time period we should be looking at for Chester and Zodiac's paths to have crossed. So was the Zodiac Killer somehow connected to the nut hulling business, or a travelling salesman of some sort, or had he done work for Chester in Turlock? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I think all the options are on the table. I think we just don't know. It could be someone that had a beef with him. Could be any number of different possibilities. There was one interesting thing that I found, that Chester Klingle did have some property purchases in Vallejo, in Solano County, I should say. I don't remember if it was Vallejo in particular, but it was definitely Solano County. Now, they were after the Zodiac crimes and after, I want to say they were after the 1990 card as well. So he does have some kind of property dealings in Solano County, but it doesn't appear that they were directly connected to the Zodiac time period.
But according to the obituary, the photocopy of the keys were mailed in while he was living in Turlock.
Yeah, and there's also been this discussion as to whether he ever lived in Eureka, and if so, when did he live there? I know during 1990, I believe that his daughter was living in Eureka. Now, Tom Voigt pointed out that any letter mailed in that county would get a Eureka post office stamp affixed to it. It would be postmarked, in Eureka, no matter where it was set in the county. So that's important too, because, there's several towns around there. It's a very, sparsely populated, very, wide open, lots of different fields and woods and stuff like that. It's not a big city by any stretch as opposed to something like Sacramento or something along those lines.
We know that Blandina, his wife, died in September 1993, and sometime shortly after, he then moved to Eureka. But of course, that doesn't rule him out from owning a post office box in Eureka prior to that. And that's where his daughter comes into play, doesn't it? So, and business deals in Eureka and Turlock.
Yeah, absolutely. You can live in one town and have a post office box in another, so there's nothing, outrageous or unlikely about that. It's very possible, especially if he was spending a lot of time there, visiting family there, or what have you. He could have easily had the P.O. box there in Eureka and not needed to be living there at the time.
So in theory, the Zodiac Killer's path could have crossed with Chester Clark Klingle in either place, Turlock or Eureka.
Yeah,
is that what we probably concluded?
It's definitely possible. On the other hand, though, along those lines, though, if they did find his keys in Turlock, they would have had to have driven to Eureka, or the Eureka area, that county anyhow, to mail the card to be postmarked from there. Is Turlock in the same county? I didn't even check that.
Turlock is about 370 miles from Eureka.
Oh, there you go. So if perfect point, if someone found his keys and wanted to frame him, they went all the way to Eureka. They made that drive there to help frame him. So to me, I think the most logical way that they got them was they got their hands on the keys in the Eureka area and mailed the letter from there. I don't personally think they would drive 300 and something miles from his town at Turlock to Eureka to mail that. But then again, if they really wanted him to be framed for something, maybe they would go that extra mile and drive that distance.
Yeah, Turlock is south of Modesto. That's why I was trying to find a link, not necessarily a Kathleen John's abduction, but she passed very close to where he had one of his nut hulling farms.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting.
Okay, 3 years later, but
it's interesting, at the least. But one thing we haven't heard from is anyone within Chester's inner circle, friends, associates, family. I think Tom Voight had a little interaction possibly with Chester's daughter. For what it's worth, I reached out to the family trying to get a little bit of more information about this, and they didn't respond. So I think a lot of this is just going to end in some unanswered questions and not knowing, was there someone that didn't like Chester, someone he had a beef with, a grudge with? Those would be interesting things to know. And unfortunately, unless they start talking or coming forward, I don't know that we'll ever know the answers.
Well, Tom was talking about the other key belonging to somebody who was young, probably in his 20s. Could that be somebody who was in business with Chester? Because why would the key be on the same key ring?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, anything's possible, or maybe somehow they happen to have access to both separate keys at the same time and they took both. It's hard to tell. Now, one interesting thing, and it probably just a coincidence, but there was someone by the last name of Klingel working at the Eureka post office in 1990. And according to Tom, it was not someone related to Chester, despite the last name being the same. I found that interesting that someone with that name was working there, because that's
not a common name.
Yeah, I guess in that area it's a common name. I don't think it's a common name in general, but in that area it must be. But I just found that interesting, and I don't want to go down a whole rabbit hole of could that person have had a grudge against Chester. Anything's possible, but I think it's just a coincidence that someone named Klingel worked at the post office there.
In regards to the Halloween card and Eureka cards, we have 2 greetings cards, 2 secret pal cards, with both communications having something inserted into the card, the skeleton and pumpkin added to the Halloween card, and the photocopied keys to the Eureka card. Both cards are tempting us with a name, and both seemingly disappoint when they're opened. We have the dripping pen card that teases us with the Snoozy and Furlong names by adding August to the running total. The addition of 4-teen to the Halloween card, possibly incorporating the 4 teenagers to date he was claiming to have killed, by cleverly giving 14 a double meaning. He teased us with the names of Donna Lass, Kathy Biak and Kathy Snoozy in his 2 cryptic 71 cards. And now in 1990, the addition of the photocopied keys to give us a clue to the name Chester. Add this to the 2001 card with the common address of 901 Mission Street and the 94103 zip code. This should go a long way to verifying the Eureka card as genuine. What are your thoughts now on the authenticity of this communication and any connections you've found between the Halloween card and the Eureka card?
Well, unfortunately, the 1990 card doesn't have a lot of writing to examine. That's what I would hope to see. And again, we don't know. Maybe the original editor had a little note that came inside of it too, and that's why they saved it as a Zodiac letter material. And then the note got lost, and it was just the card and the picture of the keys that was left. That's a possibility. But, I think that there is some similarity in the type of creation, the mindset of the person that sent the Eureka card and the Halloween card. There are some similarities in the way they put stuff in them as hints for police. So you definitely have to consider that. I know there's been a lot of online discussion lately about the Eureka card. I think more people are open to it being authentic. On a personal level, my suspect has a connection to both the Eureka and the Halloween card in a way. His birth date, for example, is the 14th of February, and the number 14 in that card could be a hint to his birthday. Tom Voigt said that there was a possibility that there were some Valentine's stickers that were mailed in the Halloween card. I tried to verify that without luck. But if there were Valentine's stickers mailed in that Halloween card, kind of weird thing to be mailing in a Halloween card, Valentine's stickers. But if that's the case, that's another clue possibility, that my suspect would mail that as a hint, as a clue to his birthday being on Valentine's Day. And then finally, the thing about Eureka in general and the whole Zodiac case is it's so far from Vallejo and San Francisco that it just doesn't seem like the type of place that would have any kind of Zodiac activity. Yet here we are with a possible Zodiac mailing from there. Well, it turns out that my suspect owned property in McKinleyville, which is, I think, 5 or 6 miles from Eureka. It's part of the county. So if he would have mailed something in that county, it would have had the Eureka postmark on it. So for me, I'm giving that a little bit more consideration because of that stuff, because I do see some parallels between the Halloween card and that card, and between my suspect in both of those mailings. So I put a little bit more stock into it, and I wish there was more we could find out about the Eureka card, but I think we should just keep digging because it's not too late to find stuff. And I think in a future episode, we're going to talk about the Albany Pigeon Boy and its possible relation to the Red Phantom letter mailed in 1974. And after years of digging, someone just found something recently and identified that boy that was involved in that story. So I think it just shows that if you keep digging with something, you never know what you're going to find. If you sit back on the sidelines and you don't do anything, you're not going to find anything. So I think it's worth people to continue digging into these old possible mailings because you never know what you're going to find.
Why would they hold back 2 innocuous stickers from the Halloween card? I can understand if the killer contacted them later, suggesting this was in the card, they would know it was him. But why would they hold that back all these years since 1970?
Well, I don't know.
I'm not doubting they exist and they probably could have been in the card. I just don't understand the concept of withholding this information.
Well, I'm looking at a couple possibilities. A, that they somehow overlooked them in describing the Halloween card and its contents. I hope that would be unlikely, that they wouldn't do something like that, that it would be held back for whatever reason. But I think it's also possible that they were not mailed in the Halloween card. The way Tom explains it, Tom got some materials from Jack Mullinex in Vallejo. Of course, he was in charge of the Zodiac case early on, and he got a bunch of material from Jack Mullinex. And one of the things that Jack had in these materials that he gave Tom were some kind of props of the Zodiac mailings. And so one of these things was a prop Zodiac card, like a duplicate. And when Tom opened it up, there were Valentine stickers in it, in this card, in this envelope. So I can't speak for Tom because I wasn't there, but I think what Tom was saying was that this was a mini version, a duplicate of what Zodiac mailed in the Halloween card, and the printing on the envelope was a duplicate, and the card was a duplicate, but inside there were these Valentine stickers. So unless they somehow got mixed up in there, in Jack Mullinex's possession, maybe he inadvertently put them in there. They wound up in there. Who knows? That could be how they got in there and how the whole rumor of these Valentine stickers started. Or when he handed this stuff to Tom, the reason that they were in there because they were a duplicate of what came in the original card. We just don't know. Jack Molinex has passed away now, so we can't ask him. So I think it's going to be one of those things that unless we get some kind of confirmation that there are Valentine's stickers in the original card, we're just not going to know for sure. But, obviously it's a clue to my suspect. So I'm interested in that, and I'd like to pinpoint if it's accurate or not, but we may never be able to do that.
So when the Eureka card was unearthed in 2007, why does it rely on Tom Voigt to go searching for the owner of these keys? Why didn't the police do it?
I don't know. I think probably what happened.
I mean, they must have enhanced the keys. People on the internet have done it, so why can't the police do it?
My thinking is, and again, I wasn't there, and Tom might have more clarity on this. My thinking is that, hey, the movie's out, it's popular, let's dig out some stuff, see if we have anything interesting. And it was just one of the things that was maybe sent to Tom as, hey, we have this stuff and here's this interesting card. And I think Tom probably took it upon himself to start digging into it, and the newspaper didn't send it to the police. And I think Tom, in his digging, and I know other people helped him dig, I think they're the ones that got the police involved in looking at it. So I don't think the newspaper sent it to the police. I think that Tom and some different people that worked on it with him encouraged the police to look at it, and that's how they started looking at it.
Now, I know there's a lot of people who don't believe the Albany letter is genuine. I don't know what you think on it. Can you just refresh my memory? Do you believe it's genuine?
You're talking about the Albany Pigeon Boy letter?
No, I'm talking about the hospital.
Oh, the Albany
Medical Center.
Medical Center. I don't. The one thing.
Remember, I was talking about the comparison of the codes and the 7.
Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting because in the FBI reports, they can't rule out the author as being Zodiac, but on the surface, it doesn't look like Zodiac that much. But, somehow they can't rule out Zodiac. It was definitely in response to the articles that ran throughout the country asking where Zodiac was. There was no doubt that whoever sent it, whether it was the real Zodiac or not, they were replying to that article that asked if the Zodiac was dead or in a hospital or what have you, and he answered them. The question is it the real Zodiac or someone just trying to get some attention? I don't know, but the fact that it was Albany, New York, of all places, all the way across the country from California, which is the same place where people like Darlene Farron and her husband, ex-husband, and, Zodiac suspect Richard Gaikowski were all hanging out there. That part interests me. I just don't know if there's enough there to say for sure.
Well, I've found a little bit more in the last week. I tried to make the point that the 2001 author of the Happy New Year card was the same author as the Eureka card because of the 901 Mission Street and the zip code of 94103. Why would somebody in 2001 use an address style so different than anything Zodiac ever used? And by the time that was mailed in 2001, the Eureka card hadn't been released, which made it very unusual. You had two greetings cards, both with the same unusual address style that Zodiac had never previously used. Now, I tended to use this as an argument to claim that both were the Zodiac Killer. So recently, I looked back at something, and if you remember, on July the 22nd, 1973, the New York Daily News wrote in respect to the Zodiac Killer, he's in jail, in a mental hospital, or just dead. The response was the Albany letter stating, you are wrong. I am not dead or in the hospital. I am alive and well. Now, this communication was unreleased to the public in 2001, as far as I'm concerned. And I think I asked you this question a week ago. 2 months before the 2001 Happy New Year card released a Zodiac article mentioning Arthur Lee Allen. This was a newspaper article just before the arrival of the 2001 card. Now, this article mentioned Arthur Lee Allen, considered him the best suspect by investigators, but stated he died of a heart attack in 1992. In the 2001 card, The author responded just like the unreleased Albany letter, stating, "You thought I was dead? No way." The Albany letter began with, "You are wrong. I am not dead." If we can authenticate the 2001 card, it may further bolster this notion of a killer still communicating in 1990. So what do you think of those two phrases, separated by many decades?
Well, I think the Zodiac had some different words and phrases that were part of his vocabulary. So anytime you see things like that, that could be him in other unconfirmed mailings, you have to give it some consideration, especially if it's stuff that wasn't widely released to the public. If some hoaxer read something in a newspaper that was printed left and right all over the place, then that would be easier to explain away. But something that was obscure that the Zodiac may have written that wasn't widely talked about being used in a second mailing would be interesting. To me, I've given up on trying to say this handwriting matches that handwriting. I think, and if I were the police, this is what I'd be working on. I would try and get DNA or fingerprints from every single possible unconfirmed Zodiac mailing, and I would try and identify each and every person that mailed all of them and start putting them on a list and then looking at everyone on that list, and so you can cross them off and see, are they either a hoaxer or are they someone that could really be Zodiac? That's what I'd be doing. I'd be trying to identify every single owner of every bit of DNA on any of those envelopes or stamps and fingerprints that might be left, and trying to say who sent these, why did they send them, and I'd make a big list.
Are you tempted to believe the 2001 card is genuine?
The 2001 card, I've been so shy of not accepting much after 1974, just because we've been trained by every document and every official report saying that the Zodiac letter stopped in 74. So I've been reluctant to think of anything after 74 as being confirmed. But now, with the whole handwriting fiasco that some of the Zodiac writing confirmed to be Zodiac writing in the Bates case, for example, was not, that sort of has jaded me a little bit, and I'm thinking that maybe I shouldn't be relying so much on handwriting and instead just look for every possible clue, which includes tracking down every different hoaxer or mailer of those letters, let's say, and just trying to figure out, could they be the Zodiac, or are they just one or more hoaxers? I think if we could get some clarity on that, that would be good, versus just relying on handwriting and saying, well, this looks or sounds like Zodiac. Let's see if we can find out with DNA or fingerprints who it is and why they sent the stuff.
I mean, we clarified this a little bit in the last episode, when I stated that if you looked at the envelope address of the Exorcist letter and compare it to the Dragon card envelope, that's where handwriting, I think, is very important, because you have almost identical handwriting, spacing, structure, full stops, commas, punctuation, exactly the same. And yet one of the envelopes was unreleased, i.e. the Dragon card. That's when I think handwriting is useful, when it compares to something that should never have been publicly released.
Yeah, and there's again, if there's a reprint of an image, it's a photograph of something, and you can see how it was written or what phrases were used, it makes it easier for a hoax to have occurred. But when something hasn't been released and you can't see how it was printed or prepared, but then it turns up again identical someplace else, it becomes a little bit harder to explain away that that's just a coincidence.
On Tom Voigt's message board, I think it's page 7, on the Chester Clark Klingle thread, the DNA report on Chester Clark Klingle said they received 6 items from his trash and tested just 2 of these items, the coffee cup lid and the chewing gum. These produced 2 separate male DNA profiles that didn't match DNA associated with the Zodiac Killer. This means they didn't exclude Chester at all, because they do not know who drank from the coffee cup lid or chewed the chewing gum. The report says nothing of taking DNA directly from Chester Clark Klingle. So what do you think of that?
I think that's interesting. I think they should have confirmed specifically that it was his.
If the report on Tom Voigt's site is all we know of.
Yeah, there could be other details or another report separate from that has other information. But a lot of times in cases where things are solved by DNA is collected, they'll physically see someone, they'll tail them and undercover and watch them throw a cup in the trash or watch them throw down a cigarette butt, and they'll walk up right behind them, pick it up with gloves on and a plastic bag and take it in evidence. And they'll be able to know with their own eyes that, yes, this DNA came from that person. When you're picking it out of the trash, it's a little bit different because you don't technically know who used it. You know, if it's his trash, it's likely that it's his, but anyone else inside the house that was there could have discarded it. When you're picking through trash, it's sort of, you know, you don't need any kind of warrants or anything like that. It's considered abandoned property. So it's just as simple as walking up and picking through the trash and taking what they want versus doing something where you're following them and watching them. I think you have to have a little bit of credentials to be doing that. But that gives you a more accurate and complete assurance that what you're getting is that person's DNA.
Yeah, I've seen many documentaries where they actually do trail a person to a restaurant and just collect some cutlery or a drinks carton or anything like that. I don't know why they didn't do that in this case.
I'm encouraged that they took it serious enough to try and get his DNA in the first place. To me, that says they were trying and then just dismiss it. So that part's encouraging. Again, I think it was worth doing and worth trying, and they definitely did. But I think the extra step, if they could have verified it was his, would have been helpful. Now, perhaps when they collected it, maybe they knew he was the only male that was in the house and no one else had been there. Since it was two different samples belonging to a male and they matched each other, then maybe they felt it was definitely his.
They didn't match.
Oh, the two samples did not match each other. Okay.
No, they could have been anybody, a guest, a friend.
Okay, so it's possible one of them was his and the other one wasn't. But either way, they didn't match the Zodiac, correct?
Yes, they didn't, no.
Yeah, so I think it's very possible that at least one of those two DNA samples was Chester's, and neither one matching just shows me that it what I already suspect, that it wasn't Chester who was Zodiac in the first place.
Also in the same DNA report, they only tested the Vallejo Times Herald envelope. They mentioned that in the report and found a trace amount of degraded human DNA. You would have thought that was from the Vallejo Times Herald envelope because that's the only one mentioned. If this communication wasn't the one that produced DNA associated with the Zodiac Killer, why would they mention it at all in the DNA report? In other words, if they have DNA associated with the Zodiac Killer and it wasn't from the Vallejo Times Herald stamps, the only other letter we know that produced a DNA profile associated with the Zodiac Killer was the 1978 letter. It states, the report, that DNA associated with the Zodiac Killer was STR-DNA partial profile, communicated to them from the San Francisco Crime Laboratory and not included in the report. So it appears that this is what has ruled out the chewing gum and coffee cup lid as having any connection to the Zodiac Killer. So why were they mentioning the Vallejo Times Herald envelope at all?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. You know, speaking of DNA, there's some discussion that the lab tech that originally handled some of that early DNA, the DNA that supposedly ruled out Arthur Lee Allen, wasn't the cleanest of handling stuff, and there's a question of contamination coming into play. But beyond that, I think that DNA was from a hair found under a stamp, which is not going to be super reliable. So I'm wondering if that's the DNA profile they used to compare against Chester Klingle's, or a second DNA, as you mentioned, that is from another source that they really definitely think could be Zodiac's. Because it's possible, if they checked Chester against that old sample that ruled out Arthur Lee Allen, that they may have been using something that was contaminated or not Zodiac's at all. I think what is encouraging is, from everything we hear, from all the hinting, from what Tom recently said, I think there's DNA in the Zodiac case, one way or another, that they're confident in and that they think really was mailed with the letter or one of the letters, we don't know which one, but it may be enough to possibly rule someone out when you compare their DNA directly to it, but it may not be enough to do forensic genealogy where you build a family tree. So there's a big difference between the two, having enough to rule someone out if you have their DNA versus do genealogy. But I think there's a sign that at least they have some kind of DNA thing working. We've been talking about that forever now, it seems like, but I think there's something going on behind the scenes that they have something worth pursuing in the DNA angle. But I think you and I talked about it before, and I just mentioned a little while ago, I'd want to know who the owner of every mailing was. You mentioned the 1978 letter having DNA.
Whether DNA was obtained.
Yeah, whether it was a hoax or not, I want to know who authored that letter. So identify that person and then see what they have to say and see if they're the Zodiac or just a hoaxer. That should be something that is done if possible. And again, if they have enough DNA to build a full profile and do genetic genealogy, they can track that person down. Or maybe they don't have enough DNA from that 1978 letter and they only have enough to compare it to someone if they have a 1-to-1 comparison to compare it to. So we'll have to see what happens.
Well, you know my opinion on the 78 letter. I think it's genuine. And that was the only one in the 1998 DNA chart that said DNA obtained. Whether that's a full profile or a very good partial, I don't know. But we know that was used to rule out Arthur Lee Allen years ago.
Yeah.
Even Michael Butterfield accepts that on his site. He did 2 articles, one called the Silver Bullet and one called the Magic Bullet or something like that. And Arthur Lee Allen was ruled out via the 78 letter. Now, they must have considered it genuine. Otherwise, why would they have used a fake letter if they believed it to be fake?
Yeah, that's one of the questions. There's a lot of questions here that are not clear to a lot of us that have been working on this case for so many years. To still not have clear answers is a little bit frustrating. I think the police could definitely clarify some things and make things simpler to understand and correct some rumors and some inaccuracies, but they've chosen not to do that. So that part is frustrating. I think, if they would come forward and just say, hey, this is true, this is not true, this is something we feel is legit, this is something we don't feel is legit, they could give us that information without telling us too much, but I don't think they're going to do that. I think we're going to all be in the dark, wondering what's accurate, wondering what's not accurate until the case is resolved.
Well, here's a bit of a weird one I found a few years ago, Mike, and wrote about it. I don't subscribe to it, by the way, before anybody starts laughing, but this is a little bit of synchronicity again. There were 2 secret PAL cards, the Halloween card and Eureka Card. The Halloween card contained many elements of the To Kill a Mockingbird novel. I don't know if you've heard about that. After the card stated, "You ache to know my name," it opened to reveal the word boo. And funnily enough, the main character in that novel was Boo Radley, and it was written by Harper Lee. So you can sort of get the connection already. We have the Rad from Paradise, and Zodiac misspelled Paul Avery's name on the envelope, spelling it Ley. All the components for the name Boo Radley, the feared man in the novel. The second secret PAL card was the Eureka Card, featuring a snowman. If the Halloween card was addressing Paul Avery, was the Eureka Card as well, even though he wasn't working at the Chronicle at that time. In the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, the children built a snowman and decorated it just like the Eureka Card. But their father asked them to take it down because it looked very like their neighbor. Their neighbor was called Mr. Avery.
That's interesting. And you mentioned that initial Paul Avery Halloween card. The Zodiac definitely was hinting at something. Again, I don't know what it was. I think I mentioned this in another episode, the way he underlined the L in Paul's first name and the AV in the second one. I don't know what he was trying to say, but LAV seemed to be a clue.
And the intersection was Rad.
Yeah, I think there's something there that Zodiac was hinting at, a little clue in his mind. Maybe it went over everyone's head. I don't know. But to me, he wouldn't underline that unless it was a clue of some sort. It just so far hasn't really led to anything directly.
No, I must add that I don't believe this is actually the case, but I thought it was unusual and worth mentioning anyway.
Yeah, and you never know what Zodiac was thinking or what made him do what he did and what messages he was trying to send. So I think it's important to look at all the possibilities and consider them and see what makes sense, what doesn't.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Autopsy. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
Hello, friends and neighbors. I am your friendly death investigator, host of the podcast Autopsy. Autopsy is a show where we take real autopsy reports from popular cases, and some not so popular, and break down the information discovered by pathologists and how it all led to their final determined cause and manner of death. Think of us as an addendum to many true crime podcasts you may already be a listener of. Every month we release a new episode, and then a more informal discussion episode follows halfway through the month. We are available on virtually every platform: iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and even YouTube. So check us out. Now, back to your regularly scheduled program.